first thing Morgan Hayes felt was the heat, sharp, blistering, invasive. It pressed against her skin like the mouth of a furnace, even though it was barely past dawn. Her vision swam as she opened her eyes to a blur of jagged sky and stone. It took a full minute before she registered the pain, and another before she realized where she was. Dangling. Her entire torso was suspended over open air, the sun already igniting the cliffside in hues of orange and white. A coarse rope was cinched around her waist, biting into her ribs, threaded through a natural rock outcrop above. Her arms were zip-tied tightly behind her back, and her legs swayed loosely below her. Each time the desert breeze kicked up, her body twisted a few agonizing inches, the rope creaking, stretching. The nylon fibers groaned like they had a decision to make. Panic simmered low in her chest, but she swallowed it down. That kind of fear didn't help. She blinked against the sweat trickling into her eyes and tried to breathe evenly. Her fractured memory was a dull puzzle. Snapshots of a solitary patrol, an outcropping of rock, boot prints that shouldn't have been there. Then the sharp sting of betrayal, a strike to the head, a dizzy fall, rough hands dragging her toward the canyon's edge. Now, this. She wasn't sure how long she'd been unconscious. Long enough for the sun to climb. Long enough for dehydration to take hold. Her tongue felt like it had been dusted with ash, and her arms throbbed with pins and needles. Every breath scraped like sandpaper. Far above, the rim of the canyon framed the sky. The ledge she must have been thrown from sat a good 20 feet higher than her current position. If the rope slipped, if the knot failed, if the rock gave out, she forced her head up to scan the cliffside. No sign of her gear, no movement, no one, no rescue. The silence felt heavy. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that came just before something snapped. Morgan had known that sound before. In Syria, in the minutes after an ambush, when the radios went dark and your heart told you the fight wasn't over yet. She bit down on the groan rising in her throat and tried to shift her weight just slightly, but the rope responded with a shrill rasp. That's when she heard it. Not a voice. Not the buzz of an approaching drone. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Her heart skipped. She blinked again, struggling to focus through the glare. The edge of the canyon, empty just moments before, now held shapes, moving ones. Sunlight glinted off a mane, the tremble of flank muscles in the heat. They came, one by one, out of the dust and rising light, as if conjured from the desert itself. Wild Mustangs, 3 in total, a deep chestnut, a pale gray, and a towering black stallion. His coat dark as obsidian, with a jagged scar slicing across his left shoulder, like lightning burned into hide. The stallion stood slightly ahead of the others, his head high, ears forward, every inch of him radiating alertness. Morgan squinted, dizzy. Hallucination. Had to be. The horses moved with unsettling coordination, not spooked by the figure dangling below. They stepped lightly over the sand, circling the outcrop, eyes on her, then the rope, then back again. The stallion approached the anchor point. His nostrils flared, muzzle dipping toward the taut line. Then, deliberately, he reached out with his teeth and tugged. Morgan's breath caught. A jolt shot up the rope. She flinched instinctively, the sudden movement wrenching her side. The stallion didn't retreat. Instead, he shifted position and pulled again, this time bracing his hooves. The other 2 horses flanked him, forming a barrier near the edge. It was insane. There was no logic, no explanation. Wild horses didn't act like this. Unless... No, she cut the thought off. There was no unless. Another pull. The rope shifted, jerking her body a few inches upward. Her shoulder slammed into the rock face. Pain flared, but she didn't cry out. She couldn't afford to scare them off if they were real. Her vision dimmed, tunneling into darkness as the blood rushed to her head. She was losing consciousness again. The last thing she saw before her eyes gave up was the black stallion stepping closer to the ledge, eyes locked on hers. Not wild, not untamed. Watching her with the calm precision of something that understood the stakes. Her lips cracked open, barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to be real." And then the world collapsed inward, folding into silence. The smell of antiseptic hit her before the light did. A sterile, chemical sharpness that made Morgan's stomach twist, reminding her of field hospitals and MASH units, and every place you didn't want to wake up. Her eyes blinked open slowly, lids dry and heavy. The light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a bluish hue over white walls and tiled floor. She registered the fourth line in her arm. An oxygen monitor clipped to her finger. Her side ached like it had been used as a punching bag, and her wrists throbbed where the zip ties had once bitten into skin. She turned her head and winced. Her throat rasped dry. There was movement. A nurse stepping in with a clipboard, eyes widening as she saw her awake. "She's conscious," the woman called over her shoulder. "Vitals are holding." Morgan tried to speak but could barely manage a croak. The nurse brought her water. It tasted like a miracle, cold, metallic, real. As sensation returned, so did the questions. She looked past the nurse toward the doorway, half expecting a familiar figure, but it wasn't who she hoped for. Captain Elise Monroe entered, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. Monroe was all angles and poise, the kind of officer who said more with a single raised brow than with a paragraph of words. "You're lucky, Hayes," Monroe said evenly. "Couple more hours and you'd have cooked under that sun." Morgan licked her cracked lips, the memories already pressing in. The fall, the rope, the black stallion. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice low and scratchy. Monroe tilted her head. "Where's what?" "The horse, the black stallion. Did anyone see it?" A pause. Not long, but long enough to feel like a judgment. "You were found alone," Monroe said carefully. "Local deputy, Ray Buckley, spotted your tracks near the ridge and called it in. You were unconscious, dehydrated, no one else was there." Morgan's pulse picked up. She shook her head, regret blooming in her chest even as the IV line tugged. "That's not possible. There were Mustangs, a whole herd. One of them, he pulled me up." Monroe's brow furrowed, just slightly. "You were concussed, suffering from sunstroke. It's not unusual to see things in that state." "I didn't imagine it," Morgan whispered. "They were real." Before Monroe could reply, the door creaked open again. Dr. Alex Wren stepped in, looking more like a college professor than a government ecologist. All disheveled curls, khaki vest, and scuffed boots. He gave a polite nod to Monroe, then turned his attention to Morgan. "I've been reviewing footage from your chest-mounted GoPro," he said, pulling a tablet from his bag. "It auto-records during field ops, correct?" Morgan nodded weakly. "Batteries set to cycle every 10 minutes. Well, I scrubbed through the last files. Most of it's corrupted, probably from the fall, but there's something." He tapped the screen, turning it toward her. Grainy, unfocused footage. A jerky frame that showed blue sky, then rock, then, briefly, a set of hooves. The black one. Scarred. Another frame, the rope stretching. Dust rising. "That's him," Morgan whispered, heart hammering. "That's the stallion." Wren glanced up. "I thought it was a fluke at first, but horses don't just interact with humans like that. Especially wild ones. And these didn't bolt, they engaged, deliberately." Monroe shifted, clearly uneasy. "Let's not jump to conclusions." Morgan sat up slightly, ignoring the pull in her side. "We need to log this, track them." "They left no signs when we arrived," Monroe said. "No hoof prints, no scat, just the drag marks from where your body was hauled up. That's what Buckley found, nothing else." But Morgan's mind was spinning. They covered their tracks. "Wild horses don't cover their tracks," Monroe snapped, then softened, realizing her tone. "You've been through hell. I'm not dismissing what you think you saw, but you need rest, not fairy tales." She left after that, the tension in the room dropping a notch. Dr. Wren lingered. "She believes in regulations," he said gently, "not in miracles." Morgan's gaze turned to the window. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting everything in gold and long shadows. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't hallucinated that moment. The pull of the rope, the feel of the wind shifting as hooves crunched nearby, the warm breath against her cheek. That night, while the clinic dozed and staff rotated shifts, Morgan rose quietly from her bed. Her limbs still protested, but she moved with the silent precision of old habits, marine instincts etched into bone. She wrapped herself in a blanket, tugged on her boots, and limped toward the rear exit. The Blackthorn outpost sat nestled in the craggy canyon basin, a forgotten corner of Arizona that even smugglers avoided. Its perimeter fence bordered open desert on 3 sides, barbed wire strung like a suggestion rather than a deterrent. Morgan leaned against a support beam and stared out into the dark. The wind picked up. Cold, still. Then, movement. At first, she thought it was a shadow, but then it stepped forward, silent as dusk, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. The black stallion. Scar still visible, mane tousled by the breeze. It stood just beyond the fence, watching her. No bridle, no markings, no hesitation. Morgan's heart surged. He was real. He hadn't left. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him. He stamped once, a quiet exhale visible in the chill, then turned and vanished into the dark. She returned to her room wordless, lungs tight, mind racing. Later, in her journal, still dusty from her pack, she wrote a single line before sleep claimed her. "I think they were meant to find me." The desert didn't give up its secrets easily, but Morgan had learned to listen between the lines, between the rustle of creosote and the drone of heat, between the silence of an outpost and the lies wrapped in formal reports. She sat at the edge of her bunk, unwrapping the gauze around her wrist. The skin beneath was raw but healing. Her ribs still hurt when she breathed deep, and the bruises painted across her side were a fading tapestry of black, yellow, and green. But she didn't care. The pain was background noise now. She spread the printed map across her lap. The one Captain Monroe had handed her after the incident. The one assigned to her for the solo recon mission that nearly killed her. Her fingers traced the patrol route in red, a direct line out to Sector 9G, an exposed swath of land with no cover, no shelter, no backup. She'd hiked that route dozens of times before, and this version was different. Someone had rerouted her. She stood and limped to her gear locker. From a hidden flap stitched inside her vest, she pulled out the laminated map she always carried, her personal copy, the one she'd marked and memorized over years. She laid them side by side, aligning the coordinates. Her gut tightened. There it was. The false route added a detour, barely noticeable unless you knew what you were looking for. A gentle arc through the cliffs, where the ambush had happened. A dead zone for comms. No surveillance coverage. No elevation to defend from. A tactical death trap. Someone had wanted her there. And not just anyone. She pulled her laptop closer and loaded the outpost's access log. Her clearance didn't give her full visibility, but it was enough to confirm what she suspected. The altered patrol map had been printed from the logistics office terminal, under credentials belonging to Silas Brandt. Brandt, the senior logistics officer, had always struck her as too polished for the job. Too many crisp collars and practiced smiles. The kind of man who always seemed to be calculating something behind his eyes. Morgan's jaw clenched. She needed more than suspicion. She needed someone who could understand what she was seeing, and someone she could trust. So she called the only person who fit both. Dr. Olivia Harrow stepped off the helipad late that afternoon, her short hair ruffled by the desert wind, aviator sunglasses tucked into her collar. She wasn't wearing a lab coat, just jeans, boots, and a fitted windbreaker that made her look more like an alpine guide than a former combat therapist. "You look like hell," Olivia said as she pulled Morgan into a brief hug. "I've had better weeks." They sat in the mess hall, quiet at this hour, just the hum of old ceiling fans and the faint hiss of static from a nearby radio. Olivia didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You really believe wild horses saved you?" "I don't believe it," Morgan replied. "Ah, I know it." Olivia tilted her head. "And you're lucid now? No hallucinations, no lingering confusion?" "I've been shot at, bombed, and buried under a collapsed compound in Syria. I know trauma. This wasn't that." Olivia studied her a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "I believe you." Morgan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "But you need to understand," Olivia continued. "If someone inside your unit tried to eliminate you, and those horses interrupted the plan, you've rattled a hornet's nest." Morgan nodded grimly. "They already broke into my cabin last night. Took my GoPro, my notebook. Anyone see them?" Number security footage was conveniently offline during the time window. So we have a falsified patrol route, a break-in, and possibly a mole in border recon. Morgan leaned forward. "And we have hoof prints." Olivia blinked. "What?" "Last week, a surveillance drone was doing a thermal sweep near Blackthorn Ridge. The footage came in this morning. A convoy of unmarked vehicles, 3 trucks moving west. And behind them, a black Mustang, same one that saved me. You think he's tracking them. I think he's watching." Later that night, under the quiet hum of generator-powered lights, Morgan sat alone at her desk, flipping through reports. She'd copied everything, logs, maps, timestamps, and stored the originals off-grid, just in case. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. They'd tried to erase her, quietly, without evidence. A fall off a cliff, an accidental death in a dangerous sector, another line on a memorial wall, a ghost gone unnoticed. But ghosts had teeth. There was a knock at her door. Sharp, hurried. Deputy Ray Buckley stepped in, his face tight. "You'd better come see this." Morgan followed him out into the crisp night air, pain biting at her side with every step. Buckley led her to the security shack, where a grainy black-and-white feed from the drone played on a flickering screen. 3 trucks, headlights off, crawling over hard terrain near a box canyon. Then, in the corner of the frame, barely visible, the black stallion. He wasn't running, wasn't chasing, he was tracking. "Son of a bitch," Buckley muttered. "He's hurting them." Morgan's breath fogged in the cold. Her heart thudded against her ribs like a war drum. "They're headed for cartel territory," Buckley added. "And that Mustang is the only one following." Morgan didn't answer. She didn't need to. The battle had already begun, and the horse had drawn first blood. And somewhere deep inside her, that old fire, the one she'd buried in Syria, flared back to life. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wind rose like a breath held too long. then exhaled through the canyons of Blackthorn Ridge in a voice that sounded nearly human. Morgan Hayes stood at the edge of the outpost, the desert cold gnawing through her jacket seams, one gloved hand resting on the smooth black mane of the stallion beside her. No saddle, no bridle, no reins, just trust. Sable lowered his head as if nodding, and Morgan swung onto his back in one fluid, silent motion, ignoring the stab of pain in her ribs. The muscles in his shoulders flexed beneath her legs. It had been years since she'd ridden without tack, and never on a wild Mustang. But the way he moved, fluid, deliberate, it felt less like riding and more like becoming part of the terrain itself. They set off under a cloak of dawn haze, Sable navigating the winding desert trails like he'd memorized them long before humans ever laid maps across these lands. Morgan carried her sidearm, a weather-worn rucksack, and a small encrypted transceiver. She told no one where she was going. If she was wrong, it would cost her. But if she was right, someone on the inside was already watching. The drone feed had been clear. 3 unmarked vehicles had made their way toward an abandoned mine near the border. One of the old operations from the 50s, now little more than rusted scaffolding and broken gates. The mine sat on no man's land, an unofficial transfer point for those needing shadows more than safety. Morgan knew the terrain better than most. She had studied every ridge and wash in her early days at the outpost, and she recognized the ridgeline Sable now followed. The stallion moved with uncanny confidence, avoiding noise, staying below sight lines, never faltering. As if he wasn't just leading, he was hunting. By midday, she saw them. The mine appeared below like a scar across the earth. 3 trucks parked in a half-circle around the rusted entrance, their tailgates down. Men moved with purpose. 2 armed guards flanked the only standing structure, a crumbling processing shack with sun-bleached walls, and in the center, emerging from one of the vehicles like a man climbing out of a grave, was Silas Brandt. He looked different out here, less polished. Gone was the pressed uniform and plastic grin. He wore desert fatigues, sunglasses, and a headset mic. At his side stood Agent Mateo Cruz, sleeves rolled to the elbows, arms crossed. Morgan's stomach twisted. The bastards hadn't even tried to hide it. They were transferring hard drives, silver, unmarked, and sealed in watertight cases, from the trucks into a modified trailer parked behind the shack. What struck her wasn't just the weapons or the tech, it was the third person they pulled from inside the trailer. A man, maybe late 20s, cuffed and bruised, his mouth duct-taped. A whistleblower. Someone who'd seen too much and was never supposed to leave. Morgan's pulse spiked. She leaned low against Sable's neck, whispering, "We need chaos." As if understanding, the stallion pawed at the ground, snorting softly. She waited until Brandt stepped behind the trailer. The guards had grown lazy, bored by stillness. That's when she moved. Slipping from Sable's back, crouching low as she approached the perimeter from behind a rusted ore conveyor. One guard yawned, the other lit a cigarette. Morgan struck like a shadow. 2 quick steps, elbow to the windpipe, twist, sweep. The man dropped without a sound. She snatched his sidearm, rolled to cover, then turned toward Sable. "Now," she whispered. Sable launched forward. He came like a storm, hooves hammering gravel, nostrils flaring, head low. One guard turned, too late. The stallion slammed into him, sending the rifle spinning. Men shouted, guns raised. Morgan darted in behind the chaos, breaking the duct-taped man's restraints and shoving him toward the cover of a drainage ditch. Gunfire erupted. A bullet clipped Sable's flank. The stallion stumbled but did not fall. Instead, he wheeled and kicked the trailer hard enough to make its wheels jump. Morgan dove behind the shack, her side burning, her blood roaring. Cruz was shouting, orders, threats, but it didn't matter now. Brandt emerged with a rifle, scanning the smoke and dust. Morgan tackled him from behind. They hit the ground hard, rolling through grit. She drove her knee into his ribs, elbowed the side of his jaw, but Brandt was strong. Stronger than she remembered. He struck back, slamming her shoulder against rock, trying to pin her. "You should have stayed dead," he hissed. Morgan headbutted him. He reeled, and she drove her fist into his throat. He gasped, went limp, and she yanked his arms behind his back, zip-tying him with his own restraints. Sirens howled in the distance. Helos inbound. Someone at the outpost must have seen the drone feed. Or maybe Buckley had guessed where she was heading. Either way, help was coming. But not fast enough. She turned and saw Sable collapse to one knee. The shot had torn into muscle. Morgan rushed to his side, crouching low, pressing her hand against the wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and slick. The stallion's chest heaved, his dark eyes half-lidded but alert. "No, no, no, not now," she muttered. "You hold on, you hear me?" The wind picked up, carrying the sound of rotor blades and boots on gravel. A dozen DHS agents stormed the compound, weapons drawn. The whistleblower was rushed to safety. Cruz was gone, vanished into the hills, but Brandt lay bound and groaning. And Morgan stayed exactly where she was, one hand on Sable's neck, the other still slick with blood. She looked up at the sky, blinked against the sting in her eyes, and screamed into her radio. "We need a med team now. He's going down." Silence for half a second. Then a voice crackled back. "Copy that. Med team en route. Hang in there." She whispered to the stallion, "You saved me once. Let me return the favor." And as the dust settled over Blackthorn Ridge, the wild Mustang they'd called Myth, Ghost, Watcher, lay bleeding in her arms. No longer just legend, but something far greater. Spring came late to Blackthorn Ridge, as it often did in the high desert. Snowmelt trickled through dry gullies like whispered promises, and the wind, once cutting and cold, now carried the warmth of something softer. Morgan Hayes stood beneath a crooked juniper tree just outside the outpost. Boots planted in red dirt, a mug of half-cold coffee in hand, watching the horizon with eyes that hadn't known rest in days. In the open corral below, Sable shifted his weight, the muscles along his shoulder twitching beneath the fading scar. The bullet wound had healed better than anyone expected, the vet said. Clean through, no major arteries hit, though the stallion had nearly bled out before they reached the makeshift surgical bay. But Sable had survived. Again. That made two of them. Morgan set the mug down on a fence post and exhaled slowly. Inside the main building, the DHS cleanup team had taken over. Silas Brandt was now in federal custody. The files he tried to sell had been decrypted and cross-referenced, exposing years of logistical tampering and collusion with cartel elements. Agent Cruz had vanished into the wind, but not before a partial ID was confirmed through satellite footage, a trail of breadcrumbs left behind by someone who knew how to disappear. The investigation was still ongoing, but it had weight now. Momentum. At the heart of it was Morgan's testimony. She'd delivered it 2 weeks ago, standing before a panel of senior officials in her full recon uniform. A healing scar splitting her left brow, voice firm and measured. She didn't embellish, didn't ask for sympathy. She spoke only about the truth, the ambush, the forged map, the drone feed, the betrayal, and about the black Mustang who had pulled her out of a canyon and stood between her and death, twice. They listened, nodded, promised further review. Then they offered her a commendation and a transfer, command post work, inside the wire, fewer risks, better hours, more pay. She said no. Instead, she submitted something else, a project proposal she'd worked on between vet check-ins and night patrols, written on coffee-stained notepads and backed by drone data, GPS trails, and dozens of hours of wildlife observation. Project Echo Run, a plan to incorporate the native Mustang herds into localized surveillance efforts in high-risk regions, not as beasts of burden or domesticated tools, but as voluntary allies. Observers, guardians. Most thought she was insane. Some read it twice. A few started asking questions she liked the sound of. Sable let out a low, familiar nicker. Morgan smiled, rubbing the stallion's neck as she opened the corral gate. He stepped through with the same quiet grace he'd always carried. The same weight of history kind of movement, like something older than men, older than borders. "No halters today," she said, voice soft. "No ropes, no fences." They walked out to the edge of the ridge together, where the sun painted the valley in gold and rust. The scrubland below stretched wide, dotted with ocotillo, yucca, and jagged basalt crags. Somewhere beyond that, wild mustangs roamed free, unbranded and untamed. They might have heard of Sable by now, the way desert creatures pass stories, through scent, sound, and trail. Morgan reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small leather collar. Simple, unadorned, save for a single etched emblem, a crescent moon and the word Echo. She held it up for a moment, then lowered it. "I won't ask you to stay," she murmured. "You've done more than anyone could ask. You saved my life. You gave me back something I thought I'd buried in Syria, the part of me that still believed in something good." Sable stepped forward and nudged her shoulder gently with his muzzle. She let the moment linger, forehead resting against his. Then she backed away, opened her hand, and let the collar fall to the ground. "If you ever come back," she said, "it'll be your choice." He stood still for a while, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Then, with a flick of his tail, he turned, trotted across the ridge and broke into a full run, disappearing into the haze of morning mist without once looking back. Morgan didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there long after he vanished, listening to the silence. Weeks passed. Project Echo Run gained traction. 2 other Mustangs had begun lingering near the outpost fence, curious but wary. Morgan took her time with them, no sudden movements, no expectations. Deputy Buckley built a new holding pen near the ravine, one with no locks and no roof, just shelter and shade. The outpost itself was different now, more alive. Younger agents asked her questions about hoof prints and tracking trails. The old-timers, like Buckley, brought her stories of other sightings. Black shapes cresting ridgelines, lone stallions watching from afar. One foggy dawn, as the mist curled low over the desert floor, a silhouette emerged just beyond the gate. Morgan stepped outside in her boots and flannel, hands jammed into her pockets. She didn't speak, didn't move. The stallion walked forward, pausing just inches from the open gate, his breath visible in the chill air. A patch of white still marked his healed flank. His eyes were calm, steady, watching. Sable had returned. She walked up to him, laid her palm against his chest. "Welcome home, Watcher," she whispered. And in that quiet space on the edge of the world, beneath a rising sun, the war was over, if only for a while.